If I could get everybody to take their seats here, we will get started. Welcome, come on in. So welcome everyone to the Arctic Research Consortium of the U.S., where Arctic research is connected since 1988. My name is Bob Rich, and I'm the ARCIS Executive Director, and thank you so much for coming to our 14th Arctic Research Seminar Series presentation in Washington, D.C., where we're delighted to welcome Sandra Starkweather. ARCIS works to connect Arctic research across boundaries through communication, coordination, and collaboration, providing the essential, intangible infrastructure required for research to advance. We're a not-for-profit consortium of organizations and individuals working together in support of inquiry, discovery, and understanding of this important region and informing sound decision-making. This seminar series is designed to provide unique access to some of the leading Arctic researchers and leaders for federal officials, members of the D.C. policy community, and the broader public interested in the changing Arctic. The ideas shared here represent the cutting edge of what we're exploring and learning up north, and also what it means for the U.S. and the rest of the world. For those of you in the room here, I encourage you to take a look at the ARCIS materials out on the table outside about membership and the services we provide. And afterwards, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have and love to hear how we can best help you as Arctic researchers and stakeholders to succeed. If you're online, you can access this information after the webinar in the Documents tab. If you're in the room, you should have received a seminar evaluation, which we'd like you to return to the registration table at the end of the seminar. And if you're online, you should be able to access an evaluation on the webinar window shortly after we're finished. For those of you on Twitter, we encourage you to use the hashtag #ArcIsWebinar to discuss the event. Now, we're currently joined here by more than 150 registered participants online from throughout the U.S. in 13 states, in Canada, Germany, Japan, Norway, Russia, and the U.K., and about 15 people here in the room in D.C. For those of you on the webinar, my colleagues are available throughout to answer any questions that you have about ARCIS or Arctic research, and to forward to us here in D.C. any questions that you have for Sandy. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions into the discussion panel on your attendee screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect them and address them during the Q&A at the end. Whether you're here or online, I invite each of you to become an ARCIS member. Currently, all types of organizations are eligible to become ARCIS members, including academic institutions, government agencies, corporations, and indigenous organizations. Anybody who cares about the importance of Arctic research can join. And individuals, too, are now eligible to become members. You can join online at www.arcis.org, or we have some application forms outside if you'd like. I need to acknowledge today the partners that helped us to make this seminar series possible. The Consortium for Ocean Leadership, which enables us to use this excellent meeting room. And thank you also to the Polar Research Board of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine for assistance with registration. And of course, I want to thank the National Science Foundation's Division of Polar Programs for major financial support to ARCIS and enabling this seminar series in particular. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Sandra Starkweather. I want to start by warning you that acronyms are thick in this business. Sandy is the Executive Director for the US Arctic Observing Network, AON, which is a new NOAA-funded position to advance interagency Arctic observing. Previously, I was delighted to work with Sandy when she was with the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, IARPC, and helping to create the IARPC 5-year plan for Arctic research. She's led coordination of Arctic observatories through the International Arctic Systems for Observing the Atmosphere, ISOA, network. Sandy's also spent 12 years in field research in Greenland. She holds a BS in engineering from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and an MS in engineering and a PhD in geography from the University of Colorado, Boulder. Please join with me in welcoming to the ARCIS DC Arctic Research Seminar Series, Dr. Sandra Starkweather, who's going to tell us about the U.S. Arctic Observing Network mobilizing interagency observing actions in an era of rapid change. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. It's nice to have someone else take care of your acronyms for you. And thanks to everybody who came, and also thanks to ARCIS for including US AON in this great seminar series. I put my own Twitter handle down there if anybody's a tweeter. I always like it when people kind of shout out what they're finding interesting throughout a talk. I want to acknowledge the contributions that Jeremy Mathis of NOAA, Will Ambrose of NSF, and Brendan Kelly of the Study of Environmental Arctic Change Search have made to some of the thinking that I'm going to attempt to outline here today, which describes how US AON has developed since its inception as an interagency initiative last fall, but I'll also go into some of the deeper history. So I'll start with some context. It's certainly been a compelling week for the rationale for the Arctic Observing Network. The 7th Symposium on the Impacts of the Ice Diminishing Arctic, which many of us attended this week, drew record crowds to 3 days of talks concerning the widespread impacts of Arctic change. And many of the talks featured some version of the image that you see here, the evolving picture of the Arctic summertime sea ice extent. The bright blue line tracks the intensity of the 2017 summertime sea ice loss against the backdrop of the climatology, which is represented by the gray band. So we go April through August and expect to see the minimum off to the right-hand side, the annual minimum off to the right-hand side of the chart. 2012 is on here in particular because it was the record-breaking year for minimum sea ice extent. We're on track with 2012. And looking at those lines relative to the climatology, it is easy to forget that the climatology is what we should expect. But I suspect that few in this audience expect that 2017 or future Arctic summers will routinely return to that climatology, return to the bounds of that gray band. And the shift in expectations is what many refer to as the new Arctic, and it was the context for the Ice Diminishing Arctic Symposium. At the symposium, I noted how just one observable variable of Arctic change, in this case sea ice extent, has implications for naval and Coast Guard missions, human security, cultural resources, biodiversity, wildlife habitat, international law, economic opportunities, mid-latitude weather, the list went on and on. This one observable variable sits at the center of a storm of concerns. It sits at the center also of a storm of decision-making. For many, what I also find interesting is that for many, sea ice extent is not even the most desirable observation related to sea ice. Many would prefer sea ice thickness, sea ice age, but this one observable variable, it's one we return to because we can observe it and we have observed it for long time periods. The recognition of the role of all Arctic observations in understanding change and supporting decisions and their interconnectedness is central to the rationale for the Arctic Observing Network. In 2006, a National Academy study, and it's nice to have some people here from the academies as well, entitled Toward an Integrated Arctic Observing Network, recognized the following. The Arctic is a region of limited resources compared to low latitudes, and the interconnectedness of Arctic systems, some of which are reflected in that system of concerns I described earlier, together with the high amplitude of projected changes, make a compelling argument for AON, that we need an AON to deliver a coherent set of pan-Arctic, long-term, multidisciplinary observations. Again, from the National Academy study, it was thus determined, there it is. It was thus determined that a key contribution, and this quote is from that report, will be to provide a framework within which existing programs can be linked and supplemented. So I'm going to return to these words, framework, linked, and supplemented in this talk. What was sought was a coherent network of networks, a pan-Arctic endeavor. So fast forward 10 years. The image here, provided courtesy of the Arctic Observing Viewer, and the URL for this website is found below, an NSF-sponsored project, is one, and I emphasize only one, depiction of the current state of Arctic observing. It's an incomplete one as well. Yet it's valuable to look at. According to this compilation, since 2007, U.S. agencies have sustained more than 10,000 terrestrial high-latitude observation sites to observe and understand the changing Arctic. Those are mostly in yellow. Add to that, what's a little harder to see in green squiggly lines behind that is agencies have also deployed 112 drifting buoys and sponsored research reflected in 132 ship tracks. This map of more than 10,000 sustained observations fairly comprehensively depicts the contributions of the NSF Arctic Observing Network research program, which has funded dozens of competitive research projects since 2007. The program is still in existence, and it currently is expecting to sustain about 20 long-term observing projects at a time into the foreseeable future. It'll be a cornerstone of the US AON. Here's an even more complex and layered view depicting large, extensive programs in sustained observing that span NOAA, DOE, NASA, the Office of Naval Research, and EPA. Each of these images is taken from an independent portal, and they largely depict different independent agency efforts. In all, they represent many thousand more observations to the ones that I showed earlier. In fact, U.S. contributions to sustained Arctic observing have been substantial since 2006, since the 2006 Academy's report. They've been substantial, if not sufficient. Yet we still lack a framework within which existing programs can be linked and supplemented. We still lack an Arctic observing network. So given this, it became timely to ask what opportunities could be harnessed through focusing on collaboration in this space. In the fall of 2016, U.S. agencies asked just that question. Led by NOAA commitments to dedicated support for collaborative development, U.S. agencies committed anew to advancing coordination for a U.S. Arctic observing network. They did so as a deliverable to the 2016 White House Arctic Science Ministerial and directly in support of SAON, the Intergovernmental Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks process. They did so in recognition that this collaboration could make many things possible, such as creating interoperability across independent efforts, the efforts reflected in the graphs I showed earlier, the plots I showed earlier. And such an initiative would also bring us into a space where we could begin to really grapple with some of the complexity, the systems complexity, the complexity of things like food webs and their vulnerabilities that span many agency mandates, and the protection of them span even more agency mandates. The complexity of rapid changes witnessed along Arctic coastlines that also transcend agency jurisdictions, and the recognition that the next advancement in Arctic system models skill lies in describing coupling between components of the Arctic system rather than just describing the states of individual components. What also becomes possible is that we can engage a diversity of stakeholders in use case scenarios. We know that we need to get beyond observations that are single purpose, that we need to start thinking about multi-purpose observations, and we need to think about how observations can be better combined to serve needs. And ultimately, this type of a collaboration across federal agencies will better enable the entire U.S. community, this last point, to engage effectively internationally on the future of the Arctic observing system. But understanding this list of possibilities, why we want to do this, what the potentials are, alone does not create a roadmap for how we're going to do this. Defining that roadmap is the current strategic concern of the US AON board, or the US AON in general, and the US AON board. Oops. Okay, so I present here two often competing views of how US AON might proceed, what I call the backward problem and the forward problem presented by Janus, the Roman god of dualities, the two faces on one head. But also, this is also the Roman god of new beginnings and transitions, and I hope not untimely endings. I find it comforting in the face of difficult challenges to invoke ancient images. It suggests that humans have grappled with problems like these for a long time. So while our problems might feel new, they're perhaps not new in the scope of humanity. On the left, we see the face of Janus looking backwards across those tens of thousands of historical observations across what I'll call the climatological Arctic, and comprehending the scope of the integration and harmonization that could be realized from existing and historical observations. We name the work to be done in this area US AON tasks. On the right, we see the face of Janus looking forward into the future towards the new Arctic with emerging requirements for decision support, emerging system dynamics, and potentially dangerous tipping points. I'll refer to the work of the forward problem as the AON framework or an AON framework, and note I do not call this a US AON framework. The framework needs to be pan-Arctic. It needs to be international. And so what I find, and what I hope I can convince you of, is that these approaches are distinct, but they're not irreconcilable. Even as Janus is one entity looking in two directions, so too can we do the same. Later in this talk, I'll provide some examples of the type of work found in both sides of the problem space. But first, I want to just explain more about how US AON is organized. And as Bob warned you, we can get into some acronyms here. So shortly after its inception last fall, and as the board first convened in January of this year, it was recognized that US AON would proceed most logically within and through the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, because it is an authoritative body established by Congress with the mandate to coordinate federal Arctic research. So it's a perfect fit, really, for what we need to do. The IARPIC, as it's called, produces an Arctic research plan, which Bob described. We've just created a new one, and the scope of the current plan is depicted in the graphic on the right. The plan is made up of 9 goals, which are represented by the 8 colored wedges around the circle, which include human health, permafrost, sea ice processes, and then they're tied together at the center with the 9th goal, the goal of advancing Arctic environmental intelligence through better linking observations, modeling, data science, and engagement research. There are 42 research objectives that support these 9 goals. 16 of them, shown here numerically, have strong ties to sustained and networked Arctic observing. This is my action photo. The red dot that swallows the room. Oh, it's very fuzzy. And so what I can say about US AON specifically, Research Objective 9.1 is directly responsive to Research Objective 9.1, which calls for the establishment of a US AON. But US AON tasks can address any relevant research objectives, any of those 16 research objectives that have those ties to observing. They can also support actions that come from other directions, from within agency mandates, from the research community, from white papers, many other quarters. So it's not limited to the plan, but the plan presents a good starting point. Back to the red dot. Okay. So the following list is really just a summary that I want to use to really clarify the relationship that US AON is really IARPIC's sustaining observing. It's the sustained observing reflected in the plan and beyond. And in that space, the board is comprised of those IARPIC agencies listed in brackets with commitments in sustained Arctic observations. The board's convened 4 times since January, and it's going to convene again next week. The board provides guidance across the US AON problem space and is formulating its terms of reference and its decision-making at present. In my role, the second bullet, I'm tasked with supporting and fostering the US AON tasks and the broader framework discussions, supporting scoping and implementation, and drawing greater collaboration into these efforts. And then researchers from some agencies have already been directed by their leadership to assist me. And then, of course, following the IARPIC collaborations model, outside partners are welcome in this space as well. And then we are using the IARPIC observing team calls, of which I'm a co-chair. The AOSIT is our acronym, another acronym, to communicate our progress, but also to draw in new collaborators. And I've also established office hours through the IARPIC collaboration space where you can call in and get more detailed information in that about what we're doing. So earlier I mentioned international and international connections, the direct relationship between US AON's formation and the efforts of SAON, the Intergovernmental Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks process. So SAON was established in 2011 to help Arctic and other nations coordinate their objectives and assets for Arctic observing. Its progress towards implementing an international Arctic observing network was recently reviewed in 2016. And I show here the #1 review recommendation to advance SAON's mission was to establish national SAON committees. So US AON is a response to this recommendation, and we are currently the only SAON country that has established such a committee, though large efforts like Interos from the European Union and other large organizations suggest a way in which other nations might provide a similar interface. In this role of international coordination, we plan to advance coherent systems for the discovery of U.S. observing assets, such as some of those Arctic observing viewers and platforms I showed earlier. How can we make them more coherent, easier to access, easier to make sense of what's going on in the U.S.? We're also going to promote collaborative actions for U.S. and international observing partnerships where possible. And finally, getting back to that framework piece, we're going to support processes and frameworks for international coordination and prioritization. And so just know that any US AON tasks or US AON efforts that I describe moving forward, these are really proceeding in this international context, but it is getting the U.S. house in order that we can better serve the international picture. So let's return to how the U.S. might proceed in this implementation role that we've set forward for ourselves. We plan to start initially with the backward problem, and I'll break down the anatomy of how I view the backward problem and then provide a very specific example. It begins by, oops, my first bullet is not, oh, it is, right. It begins by identifying critical needs, which we know is actually not hard to do. The hard part is narrowing down critical needs. But nonetheless, it does begin from things like the IARPIC plan or other comprehensive needs assessments. And then from there, we assemble relevant expertise from currently funded experts. Who's observing what that's relevant to this picture? And then we seek guidance also from design-oriented analysis, observing system experiments, or more systematic types of knowledge like indigenous knowledge systems, traditional knowledge systems that might help us understand how things need to come together. And then to carry things forward, we need to sustain a scoping dialogue about what's tractable in that shared problem space that can be addressed with minimal, at this point we have to say, minimal incremental resources. There's probably not going to be a lot of new money for the type of work we're describing. So to illustrate this process, I'll provide a specific example of an emerging NOAA-led task that will advance a specific research objective from the IARPIC plan in the area of sea ice. And sea ice forecasting is also the first goal of NOAA's Arctic vision and strategy. So there's great alignment there for NOAA to get started on sea ice. NOAA, as an agency, initiated this task by directing technical points of contact from each line office to convene and brainstorm. And the emerging task that we are describing, oops, I already jumped ahead. Let's see. I seem to be hung up here somewhere. I'll just keep talking while we figure this out. So the emerging task that we're scoping is towards an operational multi-sensor sea ice thickness product.
Is that what you want?
Oh, maybe I can just start using the clicker. Is it these buttons?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I've just been using the keyboard. Thank you. So the emerging task is towards an operational multi-sensor sea ice thickness product. And so the need, which, operational ice services, as I said earlier, sea ice thickness is really the unicorn of Arctic observables right now. There's a lot of difficulty in observing this, but there's a tremendous amount of interest. The operational ice centers and model developers have certainly identified it as a critical observation in sea ice forecasting. So what I'm showing here on the right, courtesy of Cecilia Bitz, is the results of an observing system experiment where she demonstrates through synthetic, this is in a synthetic setting where she generates synthetic observations and then shows the impacts of those observations on different forecast outcomes. And so the plots are showing the bias in the forecast, and so the more dark colors you see in any direction indicate that the model skill is not that great. But what you do see in the plot on the lower left that I have circled is that when you assimilate sea ice thickness, it virtually eliminates the forecast bias. And so observing system studies like this are really helpful for zeroing in on which observable variables are really going to be critical to changing our work. And oops, that's super fast forwards. Okay. So a great need established through those combined efforts. So even though the need is clear, the challenge, which is represented in this diagram at the right, courtesy of Walt Meyer, describes all of the multiple different types of systems that attempt to estimate and derive sea ice thickness. And what we see is it's really a multi-sensor challenge. No single sensor can do this alone. And the logos at the bottom show that it's not just a multi-sensor challenge, it's a multi-partner, multi-agency challenge, which is why the title is a multi-sensor product. These products need to be combined together with independent estimates of their uncertainty. And it takes work to do that, but we have some hope that it's possible. And so this challenge is being addressed through a task team where the experts leading the different observational efforts can convene. And we're also drawing in the representatives from the forecast modeling efforts within NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research, the National Weather Service, EMC, and the Naval Research Lab, and with the Alaska Test Bed as well, which represents an operational ice service. And the direct impact of this task is certainly going to be, we hope at the end, data product development. But we know also from experience that the indirect impact, which we're already feeling, is that these teams are learning a tremendous amount about these data products just in the process of sitting together and doing expert reviews together. For example, the product at the lower left, which is based on altimetry, performs much better in thicker ice. The in situ sensors, of course, are highly accurate, and if we understand spatial correlation through the larger fields, we understand what role they can play. Visible imagery, many people weren't aware that visible imagery in combination with 1D energy modeling could be used to estimate sea ice thickness. So there's been a lot of learning in this space already, and we're very hopeful about where we can go with this task. So I also, I'm presenting this as an example of the flavor of what US AON tasks might look like. This is just one task led by NOAA with support from other agency efforts. Other tasks are being investigated and scoped. I won't present them here today. And defining the full process, I have to emphasize this part, through which tasks will be brought forward and endorsed, is really central to the work of the board right now. We haven't done all of that. We don't really understand how that decision making is going to happen, but we do expect to have greater clarity on this process in the months ahead. And so I pause here also to just reflect on solving the backward problem. Solving the backward problem for just this one variable, I think many of you can appreciate what a high energy task this is going to be, how much effort just doing this for one variable is going to be. And I also invite you to recall that I described 16 observing intensive research objectives within the IARPIC plan alone. And even within those research objectives, there are many variables that could be derived. So you could envision that a score of task teams would begin to make meaningful progress in this space. And so it's going to be really critical to identify tasks, such as the one described above, that pay multiple dividends across research and operations. We've got many partners involved who are very interested in this piece of data, and that's going to be critical as we identify tasks moving forward. It's also going to be critical that the data products are accessible and usable to those that they're meant to serve. And another point on solving the backward problem, and this comes up a lot in critiques of how agencies have operated, is that solving the backward problem can feel somewhat piecemeal. While we can find ways that programs can be linked and supplemented, we're still not quite in that vision space of a framework that's really coherent and really easy to grasp how you're going to get involved and how you're going to move forward. And so that, of course, brings me to the forward problem. So how do we strategically develop the network for the new Arctic? It's definitely complex, and other communities have taken a run at it. So I'll outline the strategy that was employed by the Global Ocean Observing System, called the Framework for Ocean Observing, with thanks to Eric Lindstrom from NASA and David Legler from NOAA, who helped me understand how that program led the ocean community towards a coherent roadmap for observing. So here, and this is really just outlining the steps of what the FEU did, they started by identifying societal benefits such as coastal protection, food security, and biodiversity. This helps them address and answer what's going to be high impact that we're observing, what's going to pay multiple dividends. They then convened expert bodies from existing observing systems and networks to assess the technical feasibility of a host of observations, both those that were already deployed operationally, those being deployed in research mode, and those envisioned for the future. And from there, they determined a discrete list of essential ocean variables that were both high impact and highly feasible. So I apologize. This is the results of the FEU. I can apologize for them because we didn't do this. But if you have the chance to look this diagram up online and study it more closely, it is a really great learning tool. But what I'll do is I'll just map those 3 steps onto here so that you can absorb it a little bit more readily. The requirements, the societal benefits, are represented by the text on the left. The observing networks and the feasibility and the technical teams are represented by the text on the right. And then they used this quad mapping approach where they found those things that were both highly feasible and high impact, back to this idea of multiple dividends, to prioritize their first list of essential ocean variables. They didn't tackle the whole problem. They did a divide and conquer approach. They had 3 different authoritative research bodies that reflected 3 different specialties within the ocean sciences, including physics, chemistry, and biology. So they broke down their problem and solved it through these expert panels. And the success of what they were able to accomplish speaks for itself. This is a map of the currently deployed global ocean observing system, multiple platforms covering the global ocean. I sat with many of the program managers who funded this work last year, and I can attest that the data that comes out of this system, available to all international partners, is devoured by operational agencies and the research community alike. And it helped the research community begin to address questions like how much heat is stored in the ocean, a really compelling research question that you couldn't even approach without an observing system like this. And then here's the bad news. Even a powerful approach like the goose can struggle in the Arctic. This shows both the Southern Ocean and the Arctic Ocean and the extent of how the goose observations have been deployed there. And we know that there's many reasons why even powerful approaches can struggle in the Arctic. The Arctic is a different problem, and my triple, quadruple fog bow is one of my favorite graphics for demonstrating how different the Arctic can be. Goose had only 3 major scientific communities to deal with. The Arctic as a geography really has vastly more communities to deal with. We also know that we're operating behind the white curtain. You know, we've got a lot of technical constraints in cold and dark environments that hamper observing systems in a way that they're not hampered in the mid-latitudes or the tropics. And we also know that the societal benefits for the Arctic are unique. It's a unique composition of societies, peoples, and concerns that have to be thought about differently from the societal benefits defined for the global ocean observing system. Yet with all that, I would say that a straw man for an Arctic observing framework is not unattainable. Most recently, an input that was jointly developed in partnership between the Science and Technology Policy Institute and SAON, the international body I mentioned earlier. This was also a deliverable of the White House Arctic Science Ministerial, brought together observational and operational specialists from around the Arctic countries and SAON members, and they developed an Arctic-specific societal benefit framework, which I'm listing here on the left with these, this is still, I apologize, it's from the draft, and I only show 12 of the 13 that made it into the final report, but please contact me if you are interested in seeing the full report. So a really interesting piece of the puzzle for the straw man is on the table in the form of this work that was endorsed by SAON. There's many other interesting pieces on the observing network side. This, again, is a straw man. It's an incomplete list. If you don't see your program up there, send me an email and let's get it on there. These are the kinds of bodies that can be called upon to focus on a subset, a subnetwork of the problem, and look at what we might come up with a list of essential Arctic variables. So that all sounds good. I've talked about 2 different ways to tackle 2 different problems, but it's also a lot of work, and it's important to ask, can we do both, as our friends are doing here? I think Janice also might be the god of skepticism. So currently, I would say that we have strong buy-in from the board on the backward problem. But the conditions that are emerging through SAON and the STIPI work, SAON just had a retreat where it reestablished its vision for the future moving forward, reinvigorated its process, and it suggests that we could begin to approach the forward problem through SAON as well. The advantages we know of the backward problem is that the observations have already been made. They capture a history that we can never go back to, and the observations of that history are priceless. But it's also true that integrating tasks are very high energy, and they can be constrained by a lack of ancillary measurements, and they can struggle to address the emerging system questions or those related to emerging system states. The forward problem, while compelling, has many challenges as well, financial constraints and prioritization difficulties being significant. So how might we begin in our current setting? And so my recommendation when this question comes up, because I don't like saying no, is that we employ what the high-tech community calls stractics. When you have compressed timelines and urgent problems, you don't always have time to be strategic. Sometimes you have to just start where you are and simultaneously develop where you know you want to go. And so in my view, the actions that can be taken independently from within the research community or through the agencies are starting at the tactical level, fostering well-organized research networks, mobilizing them where we can towards tactical tasks such as the sea ice thickness task I described, but simultaneously putting some energy into this longer strategic vision, the framework vision, in cooperation with our international partnership, and then eventually looking at how those well-organized networks can become the building blocks of those expert teams and work on those variable lists that we described. And they both like it in spite of their skepticism. And let me see, I think I know how many slides I have left, and I'm coming into a close. So I should probably mention here that Janus was sometimes also considered the god of chaos. And without well-reasoned approaches, our efforts could become incoherent, and we can't let that happen. We also know that they're going to need strong leadership. So if US AON hopes to lead and contribute to international efforts in this space, the process will need to be easy to follow and well communicated. We'll need strong buy-in from academic communities who come forward to lead task teams and framework teams. We will need excellent and broad research questions, such as those employed by the global ocean community. How much heat is in the ocean? A very broad question that led them to their network. And we need questions like that to structure these observing approaches. So given that we've got these strong needs for coherent approaches, shared visions, excellent communication, I'd like to promote for a moment the Arctic Observing Summit, which is going to convene again in 2018, I believe for the fourth time. It began to convene in 2013. I believe this is one such venue where these kinds of conversations can be broadly advanced, and I really encourage anybody with an interest in these conversations to look into how the summit is being organized. Some material is going to be released shortly with more details. The international community convenes, there's thematic tracks, there's often a call for white papers, and I think that we should all encourage and look to the Arctic Observing Summit as a venue where we can have this conversation. Some more proximate opportunities that I'd like to bring up is that there's 3 relevant AJU sessions that are listed here. Again, you can contact me for the full links. The first 2 are complementary sessions between the policy track and the cryosphere track. The first looking really at strongly at the role of societal benefit frameworks and how they impact observing, and the second really looking at more of that right-hand side of the equation, the observing systems themselves, and how they might reflect back on their impactfulness. And then there's a third session on indicators of climate variability and change, which I anticipate will be related because indicators also suggest some task-ready ideas. So we're welcoming your submissions. Send me information about these. And then finally, I always encourage your questions. If my talk was too chaotic, if you still have questions, please email me. Or if you want to be very future-oriented, you can, of course, tweet me at MetaArctic. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sandy. And we are now going to open up for questions. We can take questions in the room, and if you're online, please enter your questions into the chat box, and we will get to them that way. So let's see, anyone in the room? Go ahead, and be sure to press the button on your microphone so that people online can hear you.
Okay, Igor Appel. There is a lot of possible questions about cooperations between agencies, international, so it's difficult to discuss some of them. Very specific questions. The very first slide shows a lot of yellow squares, supposedly with points with information. And on the other side, sea ice thickness is undoubtedly one of variable to be studied. The question is very simple. How to try to find information, for example, about sea ice thickness in Alaska? Can the Arctic Observing Network help, or it mostly coordinate efforts in studies? Very specific, small question.
Thank you. No, it's a wonderful question. So many of you are probably familiar with the work of Peter Pulsifer, who is the chair of the Arctic Data Committee and also a co-chair of the IARPIC data team. He's sort of my counterpart on the data side for observing. And one of the questions that's been floated since US AON reinitiated itself last fall was what role will we play in data discoverability, access, and that type of coherence. they're too closely related to ignore what role we should play. I think it would be wonderful, the slide that I showed earlier, the Arctic Observing Viewer, it is a collaborative platform and it does have many other U.S. agency. I mean, I think there's close to 1,000 NOAA observations in there. Molly McCammon runs also the Alaska Ocean Observing System and has a very large portal for the discovery of information. But what we find, and what I think Peter articulates well, is that we're probably not going to succeed in creating one single, what people call the one-stop shop. People have tried over and over again to create the one-stop shop. It is a really intractable problem. But what we can do is improve how those systems are interoperable, how they become aware of one another, and advance what he likes to call mapping the Arctic data ecosystem. So to provide people with maybe if you can't have a one-stop shop, maybe you can at least have a map that shows you how to walk between the different shops to get what you need. And right now, we do not have that, and I would love to see us make progress in that space. Encouraging agencies to submit more information about their observations to broader platforms is a great start.
Thank you. So I have a question online here from George Kling, and he's asking, how are the US AON task teams, like the one you described for sea ice thickness, different from, say, an IARPIC collaboration team on sea ice?
Yeah, great question, and thanks, George, for that. So what we have experienced, I think, in the last couple of years of the IARPIC collaboration teams is that they are an extremely valuable space for exchanging information and making progress. But you need to, they have a very broad mandate. So, for example, the sea ice team has many research objectives, I believe 4 research objectives, and many performance elements underneath those, maybe as many as 12. And so the IARPIC teams themselves, in their monthly meetings, can get spread pretty thin, which is not to say that they cannot impanel task teams. I would view the US AON task teams as really task teams that fall, in that respect, they are like task teams that fall under the IARPIC, the broader IARPIC efforts. We meet intersessionally. Sometimes my task teams might be dissatisfied with how frequently they get emails from me or need to meet. But it's really not distinct other than it's not distinct in its objective, it's distinct in its intensity and its focus. And it's maybe a little bit more programmatic direction, a little more leaning in than you find in a broader IARPIC collaboration team.
Great. Yeah. So somewhat of coordinate roles between the different agencies. Yeah.
So yep, exactly.
So I have a question here from Germar that says it really gets at the heart of sustainability of all of this is how can we assure funding for observations longer term?
Great question. I would say that we cannot do it without understanding the impact that our observations have on societal benefits. I think we cannot do it without understanding the impact that our observations have on our biggest research questions, on our Earth system models. That's not to say that doing those things, telling those stories very crisply and succinctly is a guarantee for the sustainment of observations, but failing to do that is, I think, a pretty clear prescription for not being able to sustain observations.
Great. So I have a question here from Wayne Roth, and given the concerns with the Trump administration about climate science, what are the funding constraints for this kind of multidisciplinary projects?
Well, we are all impacted. I mean, we're all paid to work, and so those things that as the Congress is setting its budget, that is really going to determine the type of work we do moving forward and how we work. But that's many pay grades above what I can answer. I think Diane's got a question as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
Yes, I wanted to follow up on one of the earlier questions about, you showed that list of 12 societal benefits and the mentioned the urgency of, so we have the looking back and looking forward, but then there's the here and now, where there are some decisions that communities need to make. There are some ecosystem transitions and endangered species happening now. How does that fit into prioritizing some of your tasks? So, better can be the enemy of good now.
Yeah, thank you. I will just toggle to this. I'll toggle to this slide that I held in reserve. I have two different ways that I would think about answering that question. One is that within the IARPIC, I mentioned that we created this environmental intelligence goal. And that goal is really about piecing together all of the tools that decision makers need to have assembled in order to understand their decision-making context. Observations play a role in that. Models play a huge role in that. Expert guidance plays a huge role in that. And I think an overlooked piece of research is the engagement research, the research into how people make decisions and really how they utilize information and what kind of information they need. And so within the environmental intelligence team and the environmental intelligence goal, the objective is to draw as many related activities together to sort of link that value chain and really, as Jeremy Mathis will say, to try to compress that timeline, the latency between observations, model development, and decision making. So that's one answer I had. And then the other answer relates to the slide that I've used in some other settings with this talk, and I mentioned that the board has not really hammered out its criteria for what's going to be a US AON task and what is not going to be a US AON task, but we have talked about some value criteria, and certainly we would love to see tasks come forward that have through engagement research or through things like the LCCs, the RISAs, those sort of frontline Sea Grant organizations. We would love to partner with them on tasks to accelerate the progress of information into decision making. I think that would be a great task.
Somewhat related to that, I have a question here from Colleen Strawhacker asking, can you say a bit more about how local observations from Arctic residents fit into the US AON plan?
Yeah, well, so I would say that they're every bit as much a part of it as the other types of observations that people might classically think of as being part of an observing network. Again, through tasks, I would really love to see a criteria similar to that employed by the Arctic Council and SAON, which insists that in preparing your ideas for tasks that you consider what the role of indigenous knowledge would or should be in any given task. Again, we haven't nailed down our criteria, but at our last board meeting we did talk about the role of indigenous knowledge quite a bit and wanted to do what we could to make sure that we were not using too constricted of a definition of what we meant by observations. But again, I think the expression of how that happens, we hope that will happen through how task ideas come forward and are proposed and assembled, the teams that are brought together.
Great. I'm always sensitive to boundaries between different sectors, and I'm wondering if you could say something about how or what is the role of the non-governmental research community when it comes to participating and helping to shape and helping to inform the Arctic Observing Network?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have had questions with or had conversations with many people in the community. I see a huge role for the community, especially in shaping the future of the network, in thinking about what kinds of proposals could you write, what kinds of workshops could you have, what kinds of research coordination networks might you propose that would help you move towards thinking about the observing system that your communities really need to answer its big questions. I think that is a great role for the research community. Of course, in a more ad hoc way, even the sea ice task team that we're pulling together, I've talked with many people who have research grants funded through National Science Foundation and other organizations that are highly relevant and within the bounds and scope of their own proposals. We welcome their contributions, and they would also be, they could potentially write supplements or that type of thing if they wanted to get more engaged in task teams. So I see a lot of avenues. It is important to emphasize that the intention is for this to be operating in that IARPIC collaboration space. These are open teams and open to new ideas, even a team that hasn't formed yet.
Any other questions here in the room? Any other questions online? All right. Well, thank you very much, Sandy, for a great webinar.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Let me just finish with a few concluding remarks here. So, again, thanks so much to Sandy for a great webinar. I wanted to make a couple of announcements. We have all of the recordings of the seminars are available online, and this one will be posted to the ARCIS website within a week. So you'll be able to see both the recordings and the copies of the slides. I would draw your attention, since Sandy was talking specifically about sea ice, we've just launched a new tool within our directory of Arctic researchers, which allows you to filter by people who are actually working on sea ice. So if you want to look at just those who are sea ice researchers, you can do that on the website. Also, draw your attention to the Sea Ice Prediction Network Sea Ice Outlook Report, which has been coming out monthly, just came out last week, looking at what are the predictions for the sea ice at the end of the summer. So that's up on our website as well. And finally, talking about funding, we would direct your attention to the ARCIS campaign to defend Arctic research funding, to advocate for increased funding, and you can check that out on our website as well. And finally, just remind everybody, we would love to have you become a member if you're not already. And thank you for coming out today, and hope you have a great weekend and great rest of your day. Thanks.